It was Thanksgiving dinner, and the table was set like something out of a picture book. Perfect turkey, cranberry sauce glistening under the light. Everyone chatting, laughter filling the air. But then came Daniel's voice, slicing through the warmth of it all like a cold gust of wind. "What's the deal with those medals, Walter? They look like cheap tin." The words hit me with the force of a punch. For a split second, the room spun. The clinking of silverware, the sound of my daughter's laugh. It all faded, and all I could hear was the sneer in his voice, mocking what had once been my pride, my medals, my service. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're listening from. I felt the weight of the silence settle in. Claire, my daughter, shifted uncomfortably. But Daniel, he was too smug, too self-assured, too drunk on his own sense of superiority. He had no idea what those medals meant, what they had cost. And it was all so casual, like nothing more than a punchline in a bad joke. But it wasn't set funny. Not to me. Not anymore. I tried to brush it off, force a smile, but inside I was unraveling. The man I'd fought for, bled for, had now mocked me, mocked the very thing that had given me purpose. The night dragged on, but I couldn't focus. Every word he said gnawed at me. I excused myself early, retreating to my workshop out back, away from the rest of the family, away from the eyes. The old wooden floor creaked under my boots as I stood there staring at the medals hanging on the wall. Each one was a symbol of sacrifice, of everything I'd given, everything I'd lost. And now they were just a joke. I stood there for what felt like an eternity. My hands clenched at my sides, my chest tight with a kind of anger I hadn't felt in years. Daniel had made a grave mistake. He didn't know it yet, but he would. I wasn't going to let this slide. This wasn't going to be a quick, violent outburst. No, I was going to get him back, but it would be slow, calculated, legal. I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of seeing me react with rage. Instead, I'd make him pay in the way that hurt the most. His pride, his money, his life as he knew it. I knew just the man to help me. Marcus, my old army buddy. He'd traded in his uniform for a badge at the IRS. And let me tell you, Marcus knew how to find things. People's weaknesses, their cracks. I had a hunch Daniel had plenty. I just needed to prove it. But I couldn't do it recklessly. I needed evidence, proof. A solid, undeniable case that would leave Daniel no choice but to watch as everything he'd built came crashing down. Before I continue, though, let me ask you to do me a favor. If you're listening right now, please hit that subscribe button and let me know where you're listening from. It really helps out. I stood there in the quiet of my workshop, my resolve growing stronger with each passing second. I was going to make Daniel regret every word he'd said. The days following Thanksgiving felt like walking through a fog. The insult kept replaying in my head like a bad song stuck on loop. I couldn't shake it. Daniel's words had dug deep into me, and I couldn't escape the sting. I stood in my workshop, my hands trembling as I tried to focus on the car I was repairing. The engine in front of me, the steady hum of the shop, none of it mattered. All I could see were those damn medals. Every time I passed by the wall, they mocked me. Cheap tin, Daniel had said. Cheap tin. Those words echoed in my mind, each repetition more painful than the last. Claire had apologized, of course. She came to me after dinner, her voice soft and unsure. "I'm sorry, Dad," she had said, but it didn't make a difference. She didn't understand. She didn't know how it felt to give so much of yourself to something, to sacrifice your youth, your peace, your sanity, only to have it dismissed by someone who didn't understand a damn thing. Daniel, with his expensive suits and his perfect life, had no idea what it meant to fight for something bigger than yourself, to serve, to suffer. He didn't know what it was like to live through the hell that I'd lived through. But there he was, sneering at my life's work, my honor, all for the sake of his own inflated ego. It wasn't just the words, it was the arrogance behind them, the dismissal. It was as if I had never been a part of that family, as if my sacrifices meant nothing, and that was the worst part. That was the part that stayed with me, the part that ate at me when the sun went down and I was alone with my thoughts. I couldn't just sit there, letting him get away with it. I needed a plan, a way to take back what I had lost. The respect, the honor, the dignity, but I had to be careful. I couldn't let my emotions control me. This had to be about more than just getting even. It had to be about justice. I could feel the weight of my decision pressing down on me. It was more than just revenge. This was about reclaiming something that had been stripped from me, my identity, my pride. I started going through my financial records. The bills for the workshop were piling up. Business was slower than I'd like, and I wasn't sure how long I could keep afloat. My savings, the ones I'd put away for my retirement, were starting to dwindle. But then it hit me. Daniel's arrogance wasn't just limited to his words. No, it was more than that. It was everywhere. His flashy car, his Rolex, the boat he'd bought last summer, all paid for by money he didn't deserve. It was all out in the open, and I knew how to expose it. I needed Marcus. I needed his expertise. I picked up the phone and called him. "Marcus," I said when he answered, "I need your help. Daniel Sipp's got his hands in something I don't think he can cover up much longer." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could tell Marcus was weighing his options, wondering how much he wanted to get involved. Finally, he sighed. "All right, Walter. I stepping in, but I need solid proof. I can sep it just make accusations. We need something concrete." That was exactly what I needed to hear. I wasn't going in blind. I knew what I had to do. It wasn't just about getting revenge. It was about doing it right, legally, methodically. I spent the next few days tracking Daniel's purchases. I found receipts for that damn boat, $65,000. A Rolex for $20,000. There was no way he could afford that kind of stuff on his salary. He wasn't a man of means. He was living a life funded by lies and deceit, and I was going to prove it. But I had to be careful. I couldn't rush. I couldn't just barge in and expose him. This had to be done in stages. I needed the right moment, the right evidence. I could feel the walls closing in on me. The longer I waited, the more my anger simmered, but I knew if I let that anger guide me, I'd make a mistake. This had to be a chess game, not a brawl. I was playing for keeps. I sat down one night, my fingers hovering over the keys of my old typewriter. The rhythmic click of the keys felt familiar, almost comforting. I was used to fighting my battles with my hands, but this time I was going to fight with my mind. And when it was over, Daniel would know exactly what it meant to mock a man who had given everything for his country. The weight of it all was heavy on my shoulders, but I knew one thing: I wasn't going to back down. Not now, not ever. I wasn't just going to take back my dignity. I was going to make sure Daniel paid for every word he'd said. I spent the next few days in a haze of focus. The fog from the initial betrayal had lifted, replaced by a steely determination. I wasn't going to let Daniel get away with it. Every step, every move from here on out was part of a larger plan. I had to be patient, meticulous. One wrong move and it would all fall apart. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about restoring my dignity, my honor, and I would do it right. I had Marcus, my old army buddy. We'd been through hell together, and now he was my key to unraveling Daniel's life. He might have been hesitant at first, but once he saw what Daniel was really doing, I knew he'd come through. Marcus wasn't just some IRS agent. He was a professional, and he knew how to dig. But I couldn't just sit back and wait for him to work. I had to gather the evidence. My hands were still shaking from the night of Thanksgiving, but now they were shaking with purpose. I started small, tracking Daniel's spending. That boat he'd bought for $65,000, that wasn't just a purchase. That was a red flag. The Rolex? Another one. It all screamed fraud, and I was going to prove it. But I needed more than just luxury items. I needed something undeniable. I needed receipts, contracts, invoices, anything I could get my hands on that would show Daniel wasn't playing by the rules. My son Jack was a quiet kid, but he'd always had an eye for detail. He wasn't the loud one at family gatherings, but he saw everything. The way Daniel bragged about his wealth, how he'd act like his money could solve any problem. Jack noticed something one evening when Daniel casually tossed a crumpled receipt into the trash, a receipt for a $12,000 purchase. It was buried under some old takeout containers, but Jack had sharp eyes. He found it and handed it over to me without a word. I held the receipt in my hand, the ink faint but legible. There it was, proof that Daniel was living far beyond his means. The purchase was for a new set of kitchen appliances, a high-end brand that no average salary could justify. I stuffed the receipt in my pocket and called Marcus. Marcus, I said, trying to keep my voice steady, I need a favor. I've got something. A receipt for a $12,000 purchase. I need to know if he sits claiming it on his taxes. There was a long pause before Marcus answered. I run the numbers, Walter, but I need more than just that. Get me something solid. I don't want to put my neck out without a case. I didn't need him to tell me twice. I had been collecting evidence all along. This was more than just a petty dispute. It was a legal battle waiting to happen, and I wasn't going to back down now. I spent the next few days combing through old records, invoices from the shop, financial statements. It was exhausting, but I needed every piece of the puzzle to fit together. The more I found, the more the picture became clear. Daniel wasn't just living beyond his means, he was lying about it. He was falsifying documents, hiding his true income, and living a life of luxury on borrowed money. His manipulation was so well crafted that no one had even questioned it, not until now. I started to feel like I was getting closer. The more evidence I gathered, the more I could sense that Daniel's arrogance was his downfall. He'd flaunted his wealth, unaware that the very things he had used to rub my face in the dirt were the things that would bring him down. I wasn't just looking for his mistakes. I was uncovering the blueprint of his downfall. But there was one thing I hadn't counted on. Claire, she started to ask questions, soft ones at first, like what's going on with Daniel's finances. But she wasn't stupid. She could tell something was up. I couldn't tell her yet. She wasn't ready to hear it. She didn't understand the depth of what Daniel had done. I knew she had been caught in the middle, torn between loyalty to her husband and to her father. But loyalty had a price, and sooner or later Claire would have to choose, and when that time came, I would be ready. It wasn't just about Daniel's fraud anymore. It was about everything he'd taken from me. The respect, the trust, the family bond. I wasn't just restoring my honor. I was reclaiming my place in my family's life. And this time I wasn't going to let anyone, least of all Daniel, take it from me. The next step was critical. Marcus had agreed to help, but now I needed him to move. I knew that the IRS could act quickly when they wanted to, but they needed hard evidence. The pieces were in place now. I just had to make sure they didn't slip away. I met with Marcus at a local bar, one of those quiet places where we used to drink after our tours. It was still the same, and as I sat across from him, I could feel the weight of the plan bearing down on me. "You've got everything?" he asked, his voice low, his eyes scanning the room. He was always cautious, always calculating. I nodded. "I have receipts, invoices, the works. It's just all here. I just need you to file it." Marcus rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "You sure about this? Once it sits filed, there sits no turning back." I met his gaze. "There seps no turning back." He gave me a long look, then nodded. "All right, I shall take it from here, but remember, you wanted this." I did. I wanted this more than anything. I knew the next phase would be delicate. I had the receipts, the invoices, the evidence to prove Daniel's financial deceit. But this wasn't about just piling up paperwork. No, this was about making sure I had a bulletproof case. I couldn't afford to make a single mistake. It wasn't just my pride on the line anymore. It was my family's future. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. I wasn't just avenging an insult. I was taking back control. I stood in my workshop late one night, staring at the safe. The lock on it had been changed recently. Just a precaution. Daniel wasn't the only one who could be careless with secrets. It wasn't paranoia. It was preparation. I wasn't going to leave a trail behind. Every receipt, every document had to be stored properly. One slip-up, and everything I was building would come crashing down. I couldn't afford that, not when I was so close. I knew Marcus was moving things forward on his end. His quiet investigation into Daniel's records was producing results, but I still needed more. I needed concrete proof of his income, his tax filings, his bank statements. The boat and Rolex were damning enough, but they weren't enough to secure a conviction, Not yet. I needed a bigger hit, something that would land Daniel squarely in a corner where he couldn't escape. My son Jack continued to play his part. I wasn't sure he fully understood what he was helping with, but he trusted me. He was quiet, methodical, and that's exactly what I needed right now. He would sift through the old receipts from the trash, the bills I knew Daniel had tossed out in a careless moment. The messier Daniel got, the easier it would be for me to put the pieces together. But there was one piece of the puzzle that was still missing: the contractor invoices. Daniel had hired several contractors for work on his house over the past year. One of them, a guy named Mark, had been involved in renovations. The problem was, those invoices weren't matching up. I knew Daniel had been pretending to pay, but in reality he hadn't. He'd been using fake invoices to cover up his financial mismanagement. I couldn't trust Daniel to slip up on his own, so I decided to push. I had to know for sure whether the invoices were legitimate. I reached out to Mark, posing as a concerned customer. I told him I was looking to renovate the property I had been managing and asked for details on some of his previous work. Mark, a little too eager to please, handed over a list of jobs he'd worked on, including some for Daniel. He was too trusting. It didn't matter that it was all under the table. I had what I needed now. That evening I reviewed the invoices. Something about them didn't sit right. The dates were inconsistent, and the totals didn't add up to the work that had supposedly been done. But it was more than just the invoices. It was the way Daniel had tried to cover up the discrepancies. Too much red tape, too many excuses. It was the sign of a man who had something to hide. I couldn't let this go. I spent the next few days poring over every single document I had collected. I laid the receipts out on my desk, sorting through the ones from the contractors and the ones Jack had dug up from the trash. The pattern was becoming clear. Daniel had been living a lie. His financial success wasn't real. He had been using smoke and mirrors to create an illusion of wealth. But that's when I realized something else. This wasn't just about getting Daniel for the fraud. It was about exposing the life he'd built on lies. Everything he had worked so hard to keep hidden. I wasn't just taking his wealth away. I was taking away the false image he'd so carefully crafted. And that was what hurt him the most. That was where I could break him. Because without the illusion of success, Daniel was nothing. I called Marcus again. I needed to make sure we were on the same page. I had the evidence, but Marcus was still hesitant to make his move. He didn't want to jump in without everything in order. He kept reminding me that we had to follow procedure, that every step had to be precise. I understood that, but patience was starting to wear thin. "I've got everything, Marcus," I said, my voice calm but firm. "The invoices, the receipts, the contractor work, it all points to fraud. If we don't act soon, he said he'll find a way to bury this." Marcus sighed. "I'll do what I can, Walter, but I need you to hold tight. We can rush this." "Can rush it?" I repeated, frustration creeping into my voice. "Marcus," I'm not talking about revenge anymore. This is about justice. We've got the proof. All I need is for you to make it count." There was a long pause. Then Marcus spoke again, quieter this time. "All right, Walter, we still move forward. But once we do, there's no going back. You ready for that?" I had to be. There was no turning back now. The next few weeks felt like a blur. I kept digging, but I could feel the walls closing in on Daniel. The final pieces were falling into place. His life was a house of cards, and I was about to blow it all down. The moment of reckoning was coming, and when it did, Daniel would have no choice but to watch as everything he had built came crashing down. The pressure was mounting, but so was the satisfaction of watching the pieces fall into place. Every day I spent tracking Daniel's fraudulent actions. The more I realized just how arrogant he had been. The trail of receipts, unpaid invoices, and contractor lies wasn't just a path to exposing him. It was a map of his downfall, and it had all started with a single insult, a stupid, careless remark. Cheap tin. But now, as I sat at my desk surrounded by more and more damning evidence, I knew that this wasn't just about me anymore. This was about the truth, about stripping the facade he'd so carefully built. Jack had come through once again. The receipts he found were more than just paper. They were the key to unlocking everything Daniel had tried to hide. With every new discovery, I felt myself getting closer. There was no turning back now. I was methodical in my approach. Every detail had to be accounted for. The invoices from the contractors, the receipts for the boat, the Rolex, and now a new discovery, payments Daniel had made to a shell company he had created under his name. It was brilliant, really. He'd masked his money by routing it through a business he owned that was just a front. But there was one problem: I knew how to dig deeper than he thought. And that was the moment I realized I could take it all. Not just the money, but his entire sense of security. His entire life would unravel once I was finished with him. I called Marcus again. The urgency was rising, but I couldn't afford to rush. Every step had to be planned. Every move had to be precise. We were in too deep to fail now. "Marcus," I said, my voice calm but intense. "Iset found something new. Payments to a shell company. It is Sep's all right here. If we can tie it to his personal accounts, we Sep got him." I could hear Marcus on the other end of the line, running the numbers in his head. "This is getting complicated, Walter. We start pushing the envelope now. If we go public with this, Daniel Sep's going to fight back. You sure you want to go all the way?" I didn't hesitate. "I Sep not just going all the way, Marcus. I Sep finishing this." I could almost feel his hesitation, but I knew I had him on my side. Marcus understood the weight of what was happening, but he also knew that if Daniel didn't get caught, he would never stop. The arrogance, the manipulation, it had to end. I spent the next few days gathering the last of the paperwork. The evidence was overwhelming. Daniel's financials were a mess of lies, deceit, and illegal activity. But what struck me the most wasn't the amount of money he'd stolen or the shady transactions. It was the way he had taken advantage of everyone around him. His whole life was built on manipulation, on using people as stepping stones for his own gain, and I had watched it all unfold right under my nose. I'd trusted him. I'd welcomed him into my family, into my home, and he had repaid me with mockery and deception. It was time to expose him. That evening, Claire came over to the workshop. She'd been distant lately, unsure of where to stand, caught between her loyalty to her husband and her father. It hurt more than I could admit that she hadn't taken my side. But I wasn't going to push her. She had to come to the truth on her own. She stood there, fidgeting with her coat, unsure of how to approach me. I could see the worry in her eyes, the same worry that had been in my own heart when I first realized just how far Daniel had gone. "Dad," she started, her voice low, hesitant. "I need to ask you something. Is everything okay with Daniel? I've been hearing things about his finances, about how he's been spending money." I let out a slow breath. This was the moment. I wasn't going to hold back anymore. "No, Claire, everything is not okay. Your husband has been lying, cheating, and stealing. He's been living a life built on fraud, and I have the evidence to prove it." Her eyes widened, and for the first time in a long time, I saw something resembling fear in her face. She had always been loyal to Daniel, but that loyalty was being tested now. I didn't want to put her in the middle, but I couldn't keep this from her any longer. "I have receipts, Claire. I have everything. Daniel Sip's been hiding money, making fake payments, living a life that Sip's nothing more than a lie, and Sip's going to make sure he pays for it." She looked away, her hands trembling as she clutched her purse. I could see the conflict in her. She loved Daniel, but she also loved me. And somewhere deep inside I knew she knew the truth. But it was easier for her to pretend it wasn't happening, easier to believe her husband over her father. I could see the tears welling up in her eyes, but I couldn't back down now. "This isn't sent just about the money, Claire. Is about everything. Is about the trust we had, the family we built. Daniel betrayed that. Has been using all of us, and now is taking him down." She didn't say anything. Instead, she turned away, walking out of the workshop. I felt the weight of her decision on my shoulders, but I couldn't dwell on it, not now. The clock was ticking, and Daniel had no idea what was coming. I wasn't just going to expose him. I was going to make sure he felt every single consequence of his actions. I was going to take everything from him. His reputation, his wealth, his control. I wasn't going to stop until I had nothing left to take. It had been a few weeks since I'd confronted Claire. The quiet between us was suffocating, but it was nothing compared to the silence that had settled around Daniel. He'd started to notice something wasn't right. His movements were becoming more erratic. The way he avoided phone calls, the way he began sweating at the slightest mention of anything related to finances. It was almost as if he knew a storm was coming but couldn't quite put his finger on it. I'd spent those weeks waiting for the right moment. I wasn't going to give him a chance to escape. Every time I saw him, I saw the smugness on his face, the arrogance that had once made me feel like nothing, and it only fueled my desire to make him pay. But the worst part? It wasn't just the betrayal that stung. It was the way he acted like he was untouchable, like no one could ever figure him out. But I knew better. I had the pieces, and soon the whole world would see just how fragile his empire was. I had Marcus on the case, gathering information, pulling the strings behind the scenes. He was digging into Daniel's hidden accounts, tracing his assets, and building the case. But even Marcus couldn't move as fast as I needed. The walls were closing in on Daniel, and I could feel the pressure mounting. Every day felt like a countdown, and I was getting closer to the point of no return. One afternoon, Jack came to me with more evidence. A stack of documents he'd found in the trash outside Daniel's office. The papers were half buried, but Jack had sharp eyes. Among the discarded sheets there was one document that stood out, a list of payments made to contractors for repairs at Daniel's properties, all dated within the past few months. What struck me immediately was the discrepancy between the dates on the invoices and the actual work done. Daniel had been signing off on jobs that had either never been completed or were grossly overpriced. I held the paper in my hands, feeling the weight of it settle in my gut. It was the missing link, the final piece that tied everything together. I had all the evidence I needed to take him down, but the tension was rising. Every minute, every phone call, every movement Daniel made only pushed him closer to the edge, and yet he had no idea how deep he was sinking. I thought about Marcus, how he had warned me to wait, to let him handle it step by step. But the waiting was becoming unbearable. The longer I let Daniel walk free, the more time he had to bury the truth. He was too slick, too confident in his lies. But I was done playing the waiting game. I'd waited too long already. Late one evening, I received an email from Marcus. The IRS investigation had moved forward. He'd found something massive, an undisclosed account in Daniel's name, an account he had been using to launder money. It was all legal on the surface, a well-disguised scheme designed to funnel money away from taxes. But now Marcus had everything: bank statements, wire transfers, financial records, all showing Daniel's direct involvement in illegal activity. I leaned back in my chair, the weight of the discovery hitting me hard. It was over. The evidence was irrefutable. But as I sat there staring at the screen, I couldn't help but wonder, what next? Once the hammer fell, what would it do to my family? To Claire, she would hate me for this. I knew she would. She would blame me for tearing her family apart, for exposing her husband in such a public way. But I couldn't let that stop me. I couldn't let Daniel's manipulation tear apart everything I'd worked for. I had to finish what I started, for myself, for the truth. I made the decision right then. The next morning I would go to the authorities, hand over the evidence, and bring Daniel's entire operation to a halt. This wasn't about hurting him. It was about making him pay for everything he'd done to me, to my family. It was about justice. But I wasn't naive. I knew Daniel wouldn't go down without a fight. He was too proud, too arrogant, and he'd already started to panic. He wasn't going to just roll over. He would fight back with everything he had. I could feel it. And as I prepared to move forward, the tension in my chest grew, the calm before the storm. There was a sense of inevitability in the air, something I couldn't shake. I knew the next few days would change everything, not just for Daniel, but for everyone involved. Once the truth came out, there would be no going back. That night I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. My mind kept racing, running through every scenario, every possible outcome. Would Claire stand by me? Would she finally see the truth? Or would I lose her forever in this pursuit of justice? I didn't know. And that uncertainty gnawed at me. But one thing was clear. I had to do this for me, for the honor I'd sacrificed so much for. I could hear Daniel's laughter echoing in my mind, his words mocking me. But I wasn't the man I used to be. I wasn't the man who let things slide, who let insults roll off his back. No, I was a man with a plan, a man who knew how to make others face the consequences of their actions. And Daniel, he was about to learn just how costly arrogance could be. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with tension. The noise outside faded into silence. As I stood at the front, the weight of my evidence heavy in my hands, I had expected the courtroom to be just another battleground, just another step in the long journey to expose Daniel for the fraud he was. But standing there facing him across the room, it felt real. All the planning, all the quiet work had come to this moment. Daniel sat in the defendant's chair, his lawyer whispering in his ear, his face flushed with panic. His arrogance, so thick and loud in every conversation, had finally crumbled. There he was, sweating, visibly uncomfortable, and trying to maintain some semblance of confidence. It was almost poetic how quickly the man who had belittled me, mocked my service, and treated everyone like pawns in his game had been reduced to this. He was nothing more than a man on trial for his own lies. I hadn't expected Claire to be there. She had made her choice, hadn't she? But when she walked into the courtroom, her eyes met mine across the room. For a brief moment, the world stood still. Her expression was unreadable, a mixture of disbelief and sadness. She had to know by now that the evidence against her husband was irrefutable. She had to know what kind of man Daniel truly was, and yet she still couldn't bring herself to stand with me. Still, I wasn't surprised. Some things were too painful to face. My son Jack sat in the back of the room, his eyes locked on me, a silent reminder that I wasn't alone in this. He had helped me gather the evidence, helped me watch the pieces fall into place. And though he hadn't said much, his presence in that courtroom spoke volumes. He believed in me, even when his mother couldn't. That mattered more than anything. The judge called the court to order, and the room grew quiet. The time had come. I handed over the pile of documents to my lawyer, who stood beside me, ready to lay the case out. But I knew what needed to be said. This wasn't just about the money Daniel had stolen or the luxuries he had flaunted. This was about principle. This was about justice. About showing that no matter how far someone thought they could climb, no one could outrun the truth. Your Honor, my lawyer began. We present today a case of financial fraud, tax evasion, and falsified documentation. The defendant, Daniel Moore, has been operating a web of lies and deceit that has cost many people, including the plaintiff, dearly. I couldn't help but glance at Daniel's face. His jaw tightened as the charges were laid out, but he remained silent. His lawyer stood ready to argue, but I could see the cracks. His defense was flimsy, just a veil over the truth. They tried to twist the story, argue that the receipts were inconclusive, that the invoices were not direct proof of fraud, but there was no getting around it. The facts were too clear. Daniel had been stealing from people who trusted him, living a lie for years. Then came the moment I had been waiting for, the moment when I knew Daniel would have to face the consequences of his actions. Your Honor, I said, standing on shaky legs, my voice steady despite the weight of the moment, I have the evidence right here. The payments made to contractors that never happened, the luxury purchases far beyond his means, the falsified documents. I've kept it all. I watched Daniel live a life of excess while the rest of us struggled to keep up. I trusted him with my family, and he betrayed us all. I placed the pile of documents on the table, one by one. The boat receipt, the Rolex invoice, the contractor's invoices, all marked with dates that didn't match the work. Each document hit the table with a weight that reverberated through the room. This wasn't just a matter of financial fraud. It was a betrayal of trust, a betrayal of family, a betrayal of everything I had believed in when I allowed Daniel into our lives. Claire's face was ashen. She looked down at her hands, the realization settling in like a cold shadow. For a moment I felt nothing but sadness for her. She had tried to protect her husband, but the truth had a way of cutting through even the strongest of walls. Daniel's lawyer tried to salvage the situation, questioning the authenticity of the evidence. attempting to cast doubt on every piece of the case. But with every rebuttal, I could see his confidence slip further. His argument was weak, unconvincing. He could try to hide behind semantics, but Daniel was done. The truth had caught up with him, and it was dragging him under. The tension in the room was palpable as the judge reviewed the evidence. I could hear Daniel's lawyer whispering frantically, trying to find an angle, some last-minute defense, but it was too late. I had already won. Finally, the judge spoke. Mr. Moore, it is clear from the evidence presented that you have engaged in a pattern of deceit and financial fraud. The court finds you guilty of all charges. Sentencing will be determined at a later date. The words hit like a wave crashing over me. It was done. Daniel had been exposed, his lies laid bare for everyone to see. The relief was overwhelming, but it was also bittersweet. I had fought for justice, but the victory didn't feel sweet. It felt like an end. As the courtroom erupted into quiet murmurs, I stood there, my heart heavy. I hadn't done this for revenge. I'd done it for justice, for the truth. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape the feeling that something had been lost in the process. The damage had been done. Daniel, defeated and broken, was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, his head low, his arrogance shattered. Claire stayed behind, her eyes avoiding mine. She hadn't chosen my side, but she couldn't deny what had happened, and though she would never admit it, I knew she understood. As I walked out of the courtroom, Jack by my side, I couldn't help but reflect on the journey. The battle wasn't just won in the courtroom, it had been won inside me, in the quiet moments when I made the choice to fight, to reclaim my dignity, to restore my honor. But even with that victory, I couldn't shake the feeling that the price had been too high. The days that followed the trial felt like an uneasy calm after a storm. The courtroom had been the culmination of years of anger, resentment, and a quiet but growing desire for justice. But now that it was over, the aftermath hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Daniel's fate was sealed, his assets seized, his reputation shattered. But the cost of all this was far greater than I had anticipated. Claire barely spoke to me after the verdict. It wasn't anger, it wasn't even resentment. It was something worse. Silence. The kind of silence that stretched on for days, wrapping around us like a heavy fog. I had expected it to be hard for her to accept, but the way she retreated into herself was harder to bear than I ever imagined. We'd always been a family that spoke our minds, that hashed things out even when it was difficult. But now there was nothing. She wouldn't meet my gaze. Her eyes avoided mine whenever we crossed paths. I had destroyed the family dynamic, and though I knew it had to be done, I couldn't help but feel the weight of that loss. Jack, on the other hand, was different. He'd always been quiet, always observed more than he spoke. But something had changed in him. He looked at me with a new kind of respect. Respect I hadn't earned through my words, but through my actions. He saw the cost of what I had done, the toll it had taken on our family, and yet he understood. He never said it outright, but the way he stood by me during the trial spoke volumes. I didn't need his approval, but I could feel the weight of his support in the way he looked at me. It wasn't just the family that was affected. Word spread quickly about Daniel's downfall. The press caught wind of the trial, and soon enough it was plastered across newspapers and online articles. The man who had once been seen as successful, confident, untouchable, was now the face of financial fraud. His extravagant lifestyle, his boat, his Rolex, the house that he'd boasted about, all of it was exposed for what it was, a lie built on deception and greed. The world now knew the truth about Daniel Moore, and it wasn't kind. Claire filed for divorce not long after the trial. I hadn't expected her to stay. How could she? She was caught in the middle, a woman who had been forced to choose between her husband and her father. I knew it tore her apart, but I also knew she couldn't continue to live in a house of lies. Still, it didn't make it easier. Watching her leave, her face pale and unreadable, felt like watching the last remnants of my family slip away, and for the first time in a long time I wondered if it was all worth it. Daniel's assets were auctioned off. His boat, his prized possession, was sold for a fraction of its value. His car was repossessed, his house foreclosed. The world he had built was collapsing around him, and for a brief moment, I felt a bitter satisfaction in seeing it all come undone. But that satisfaction was short-lived. It was replaced by something else, an emptiness. I had taken down the man who had wronged me, but in doing so I had lost so much more. The workshop, once my sanctuary, felt different. It was still the place where I had spent my days building and fixing, but now it felt hollow. The shelves were stocked with tools, but there was no joy in the work anymore. It was just a job now, a distraction from the noise in my head. The quiet after the storm was deafening, and no amount of oil or grease could drown it out. Jack was becoming more withdrawn, too. He wasn't angry, but I could tell he was struggling. I had brought him into this mess, shown him the truth, but I wasn't sure if I had done the right thing. He had seen me fight for what I believed was justice. But what had it cost him? I couldn't protect him from the fallout. I couldn't shield him from the consequences of my decisions. As I sat in the workshop late one night, staring at the metal pieces I was working on, I realized that the battle wasn't really over. The justice I had fought for wasn't just about bringing Daniel down. It was about me, too. It was about facing the truth. No matter how painful, I had won, but in winning I had lost my family. I didn't know what the future held for us. I didn't know if Claire and I could ever rebuild what we once had. I didn't know if Jack would ever look at me the same way again. But what I did know was this: I had done what I had to do. I had fought for the truth, for my dignity, for my honor, and though I wasn't sure what the cost would be in the long run, I knew one thing for certain: I wouldn't back down. The consequences of Daniel's actions were only beginning to unfold. His reputation was ruined, his finances in shambles, and his life was nothing but a shadow of what it had once been. But I wasn't gloating, I wasn't celebrating. It had never been about that. It had been about reclaiming what was rightfully mine, my honor, my family's trust, and my peace of mind. And now, as the dust settled around us, I realized that it wasn't the revenge I'd sought, it was justice. But justice came with its own price, and I was still trying to figure out if I was willing to pay it. The weeks following the trial felt like they moved at a different pace. Time seemed to stretch, each day blending into the next, but nothing ever quite felt the same. The victory, the justice, the sense of righting the wrong, it all felt like a distant echo. Sure, the court had spoken, Daniel had been convicted, but the weight of it all was heavier than I had imagined. It was one thing to bring someone like Daniel down. It was another to see the destruction left in his wake. The papers had long since stopped covering his fall, but the damage lingered. His name, once synonymous with success, was now associated with fraud and deceit. It wasn't just his money that was lost. It was his life, his identity. Everything he had built on the lies of grandeur had crumbled to dust, and there in the ashes was my reflection. But what about me? What about what I had lost in this fight? I had won in the eyes of the law, but did that make me whole again? The truth was, the courtroom had delivered its verdict, but there was no ruling for the broken pieces of my family, for the trust that had been shattered, or for the silence that had replaced the warmth of our home. I found myself staring out the window more than I used to, watching the world pass by, wondering where everything went wrong. Sure, I had taken down Daniel, but at what cost? I had hoped that when justice was served, everything would return to normal, that the scars of betrayal, of humiliation would fade into the past. But the truth was, I had changed too, and the question I kept asking myself was whether the change had been for the better. Claire had filed for divorce a few days after the verdict. Her decision had felt like a knife to the chest, but it was also something I knew had to happen. She couldn't stay with a man who had been exposed, whose lies were now public knowledge, and I couldn't continue living with someone who had stayed blind to the truth for so long. I couldn't ask her to choose me over him. But the silence that followed her leaving was deafening. It wasn't anger or bitterness. It was an overwhelming sense of loss. There was a part of me that felt relieved after all. The truth had come out, the weight was lifted, and the lies were exposed. But another part of me, the part that still loved her, the part that was still a father, felt that hole inside me grow. She had been the one constant in my life, and now she was gone. I wasn't sure if I was angry at her for leaving, or at myself for driving her away. Jack came to visit every few days, but his visits had changed. He wasn't the same quiet boy I had raised. There was a maturity in him now, an understanding of the weight of everything that had happened. The look in his eyes when he saw me, when he looked at the man I had become, was both comforting and unsettling. He respected me, but there was also a sadness there, a silent acknowledgment that the family they once knew was broken beyond repair. I had done what I set out to do, but it hadn't fixed anything. The justice I had fought for was a bitter kind of victory. It wasn't like I had imagined. There was no grand moment of triumph, no sense of satisfaction in seeing Daniel's downfall. The courtroom victory hadn't given me back my family. It hadn't undone the years of damage caused by his lies and my silence. Daniel's life had unraveled in a way that was almost poetic. His business was shuttered, his assets liquidated, his reputation in tatters, but none of it mattered to me. Watching his world fall apart hadn't given me peace. It had only reminded me of the cost of it all. I had thought that seeing him suffer would bring me relief, but it didn't. The anger that had fueled my pursuit of justice had dissipated, leaving only emptiness behind. But the one thing I couldn't shake was the feeling that I had done the right thing. There was no question about that. I had exposed the truth, and the world now knew who Daniel was. His lies had caught up with him, and in that sense the scales had been balanced. There was justice in its purest form, and for that I could find a measure of peace. As I sat alone in the quiet of the workshop, I realized that justice wasn't something that could heal the wounds. It didn't restore the love I had lost, nor could it bring back the life I had once known, but it was something, and maybe, for now, that was enough. Daniel's punishment would continue. The fines, the restitution, the public humiliation. It was a long road ahead for him, but as the months passed, I found myself more at peace with the situation. The anger had faded, replaced by something that felt a lot like acceptance. I had done what needed to be done, and now it was time to move on. The justice had been served, but the true cost of it, that was something I would carry with me, perhaps for the rest of my life. It's funny how time can make everything feel like a distant memory. The sharp edges of the past dulling, until all that's left is the faint echo of what once was. I still think about the trial, about Daniel, but it doesn't consume me anymore. The anger I once felt, the relentless drive for justice, it all faded into something quieter. And in that quiet, I found something I didn't expect: peace. But it wasn't the peace I had imagined. It wasn't the sweet satisfaction of watching Daniel lose everything. No, it was more complicated than that. Watching him go down, seeing his life fall apart, didn't fill me with victory. It filled me with a kind of emptiness. He'd been a part of my life for so long. My daughter's husband, the man I once welcomed into my home. And now he was nothing. But it didn't bring me the relief I thought it would. It just left me with the stark realization of how far I had come from the man I used to be. The workshop is still there. I still spend hours at the workbench, but it's not the same. There's no joy in it anymore. I fix things, I rebuild, but the pieces don't fit like they used to. I used to love the work, the way I could see something broken come back to life under my hands. Now it just feels like something I do to fill the silence. The silence that now lives in the space where my family used to be. I still haven't heard from Claire. She hasn't called, and I haven't reached out. Maybe it's because I'm not sure what I'd say. How do you rebuild something when the foundation has cracked so deeply? We were once a family, a unit. And now we're strangers. The painful truth is, I don't think I ever really knew Daniel, not until the end, when the truth spilled out and shattered everything. But even then, I don't think I fully understood the weight of what I had done. Jack has changed too. He doesn't speak much about the trial anymore, but I see it in the way he looks at me. There's respect, sure, but there's something else there, something I can't quite place. He's seen me fight for justice, and he's seen the cost of that fight. He's a quiet kid, but I know he understands the gravity of everything. I just don't know if he'll ever forgive me for how it all played out. I've had a lot of time to think about it all. About justice, about revenge. I used to think they were one and the same, that once I exposed the truth, once I made Daniel pay, I would feel whole again. But I don't. The truth has a way of leaving scars. And in the quiet moments when I'm alone with my thoughts, I can't help but wonder if I've paid a price too. Justice isn't a clean victory. It doesn't restore the things you've lost. It doesn't bring back the love you thought you'd have forever. The thing about justice is that it's like a blade. It cuts deep, but it doesn't always heal. I thought I'd get a sense of closure when the trial was over. I thought seeing Daniel stripped of his wealth and his power would bring me peace. But all it brought was a reminder of the things I couldn't undo, the family I couldn't save, the trust I couldn't rebuild. Still, I know I did the right thing. I can say that with certainty. I didn't do it for revenge. I didn't do it to watch him suffer. I did it because it was the right thing to do. And that has to be enough. Claire left. Jack still visits. I still fix things in the workshop, though it doesn't fill me the way it once did. And Daniel? He's out there somewhere, picking up the pieces of his life, trying to figure out how to live without the lies he's built it on. But I don't think about him much anymore. I've had enough of him. I've had enough of all of it. The days go on, the seasons change, and I keep moving forward, one foot in front of the other. I don't know what the future holds, but I've learned something through all of this. Sometimes justice doesn't come with a reward, it comes with a cost. And the only thing you can do is keep walking, keep moving, and hope that someday you find peace. You didn't lose me, Daniel, I whisper to myself. The words now almost a mantra. You gave me away. And with that, I let it go. I don't know if I'll ever fully heal, but I know that I won't be the same man I was when this all started. I'm something different now, something better, I hope. The scars are still there, but I've learned to live with them, and maybe, just maybe, that's the most important thing of all.